Hello, and welcome to today's webinar where we are going to take a look back over the past year and a bit and look at our V6 and V7 releases, have a little bit of a recap of the new features and the fixes that are included in those releases, and then take a look at what we have coming up in the future. My name is Chris Parker. I'm the Customer Success Director for EMEA and APAC, and together with my colleague Matthew Lang, we will present this session together. I will make a start, and then I will hand over to Matt to continue. So the agenda for today, I'm just going to take a quick recap of the version 6 releases, specifically the version 6.1 series. We'll then look at the version 7, and that will cover version 7.0 and 7.1. And then we'll just dive into some of the new features that are available in version 7, and that they're listed there. And then we'll look at what's coming soon in the future releases 7.2 and beyond. There is always full release notes available which go into a lot more detail of some of the bug fixes. I'm not going to highlight every single one because there's quite a few over all of the releases that we're talking about today. But there is a QR code there you can scan, and also the link to our consolidated release notes on our documentation website, where all of this information is also available for you to digest. So first of all, the V6 patch releases. So version 6.1.0 was actually released back in July 2019. And over the course of a few years, we've had many bug fixes released of the 6.10 series, with the final version, the final patch release 6.1.24 was released in December 2023. All of these features, feature a significant number of bug fixes, some of which have been found ourselves internally, some of which some of our customers have found and helped us to fix. We've also backported some new features. So some of the version 7 features are available in some of the later 6.1 releases, where we deem them to be significant and of a benefit to you as a customer. As of December 2023, we released the 6.1.24. That is the final patch release that we expect to release for the 6.1 series. And in August 2024, 6.1 will reach end of life. So if you are a 6.1 customer, now would be a good time to start considering upgrading to version 7. A couple of the key features that were backported from 7 into 6, IPv6 support has been something that a few customers have been asking for a while, so that has been backported. There's also some improvements to some of the connector commands, connector graceful stop, for example, which allows a more graceful, as the name suggests, graceful stop of the connector, allowing sessions to terminate cleanly rather than be terminated abruptly. And there's also improvements to the tprovision command, which allows you to provision and restore nodes. This command was renamed tprovision, but some of you may know it by its previous name, which was Tungsten provision slave. So the version 7 release, the 7.00 was first released in March 2022. This was our first major release in 2 years and contains quite a lot of new features. So we have a new public API, we have some changes to security, a complete refocus on the way security is implemented. We have 2 new topologies. We have dynamic active-active, and we also have another topology called dynamic Datasource groups. We now enable you to install the connector in Docker from 7.03 onwards. Further improvements to backup and recovery, overhaul of the dashboard, and some enhancements and changes and fixes to a lot of the monitoring tools. As you can see, we've only had 4 releases of 7.0 in total. So 7.0 in March 2022 and April 2023 saw the release of 7.03. As of at the time of recording, we don't anticipate there to be any more 7.0 releases, as in August 2023, we actually released 7.1.0. and this is now the new 7 series that we are supporting and building and working on. So here we have the introduction of the distributed data source groups I mentioned on the previous slide. We have a few more TPM tools for certificate management that helps the conversion and the introduction of the new security features that came into version 7. The T-Provision can now support MySQL clone if you're using MySQL 8 onwards. We also have support for MySQL dual passwords, and there's a few other new features again that are starting to come through in this 7.10 release. And again, as I mentioned at the start, all of this can be viewed in the consolidated release notes. And at the time of recording, the last 7.11 release that was published was 7.11 December 2023. So let's have a look at some of what these new features are that came into the version 7 series. And this is version 7.0 and version 7.1, unless I state otherwise. So all of this was introduced initially in 7.0. We introduced a new API v2. Why v2? Well, it is the second version of it. There was a version of the API in the older releases. It just wasn't publicly documented or easily accessible. It wasn't really designed for use outside of the software, so to speak. So v2 now is a fully published API, allowing you, the customer, greater control and access. It allows you to write your own scripts, make calls to the API, configure the cluster via the API, make changes, and also obviously obtain status information, which gives you greater flexibility to plug into your own monitoring solutions. By default, as it mentions here, by default only allows the ping and the create admin user when you install it. But once you have that admin user configured, then you have the full access. And there is a link here to the documentation where you can read a lot more about that, see all the various calls, how to use it, how to set it up, and some examples of the kinds of things you can do with that. Now, I mentioned we made a lot of security changes. So from version 7.0, by default, security is enabled. Previously, it was disabled by default. Now, this introduces security across all the components. So as you can see there, all of the various endpoint communication, so between the application and the connector, and then the connectors through to the manager and the database, the managers to the database, the replicator to the database, and also between the replicators. It's much more complex to set up. So it is something that if you are wanting to enable, I highly recommend that you read the documentation pages. There are many different ways to configure it, whether you allow us to generate the certificates and the keys for you, or whether you want to use your own. There are lots of options there. If you are upgrading from version 7 from version 6 to version 7, then we do not force security at the point of upgrade. If your version 6 installation has security explicitly disabled, then when you upgrade, it will continue to be disabled. So the change in the default is only on a new installation. But we have plenty of documentation that will help you in converting and enabling security if that is something that you wish to do. Dynamic active-active. So this is a new topology. It's from your perspective, it would look like you are installing an active-active cluster. So both of your clusters can receive writes, so they're both open for writes. However, it operates as though it's active-passive. So the way this works is that the connectors are configured in such a way to say, I want to send all of my writes to a specific place. And we do that by using what we call the connector affinity. So the connector affinity in the example here says my affinity is alpha, beta. So by default, wherever the connector is, the writes will always go through to the alpha cluster. Should the alpha cluster fail, writes will then reroute to the beta cluster. So the benefit of this topology is it gives you it gives you the operational viewpoint of being active passive in that all of your writes go to one place. But because the cluster is set up fully active, it prevents the need for the manual failover and switches if you are using true active passive. It enables applications to switch over much quicker There's no manual intervention to promote the other cluster to be active. It's all handled at the cluster, at the connector level. And then obviously there's the option there to auto fail back. So in this example where we have alpha and beta, writes go to alpha, alpha fails, writes go to beta. What happens when alpha is available again? Well, you can choose. You can either say, actually, keep everything in beta, I don't mind, or move everything back to alpha. So you have that control over how you want to do that. And again, the documentation page there explains all of that to you. Next, we have distributed data source groups. So this was introduced in version 7.1.0. The distributed data source groups, or DDG, are at their core, it's a single standalone cluster with the odd number of nodes, as you would typically expect. So the example here, we have 7 nodes in the diagram shown. All of those nodes are all part of the same cluster with the same service name. So for example, let's call this alpha. But however, what the difference is, we have grouped those nodes into groups. So at the top there, you see the primary and the 2 replicas. These are typically group 1, and then you have the 2 replicas on the left, group 2, and the 2 replicas on the right, group 3. Now, typically, if this was a standalone cluster where all of the nodes were acting together, if the primary was to fail, any one of the remaining 6 nodes could be promoted to the primary. With the distributed data source group, what you're actually saying is only failover within the group. So in this case, if the primary fails in group 1, only either of the 2 replicas in group 1 would be that candidate to be the new primary. The other 2 groups would remain replicas and would never be promoted, with the exception that if all of the nodes in group 1 were to fail, so the primary and the 2 replicas were no longer available, only then would we promote one of the replicas in the other group to be a primary. It's kind of like an active-passive cluster. However, everything is within the one single cluster. So we're subdividing the nodes into their own individual groups with their own individual roles. From a connector standpoint, it will see the single primary and it will send the writes there, but the reads can come from any of those nodes. The advantage of this is that your distributed data source groups could actually reside in different data centers. So we would typically say if you are running a standalone cluster, a single cluster with 3 nodes, 5 nodes, 7 nodes, they would all need to be within the same data center to ensure that you don't have any issues with latency between your data centers, any issues there that would cause potential flopping of the nodes. Because of the way the distributed data source groups are set up, the individual groups could be in different data centers. So in the example in this diagram, the group with the primary and the 2 replicas could be in your US East data center. The other 2 groups could be in US West. They could be separated geographically as well. As I say, this is a new feature that came in 7.1.0. And available from 7.03 onwards, we shipped the first version of the standalone connector available as a Docker installation. So it's available to all licensed clustering users. If you want to distribute your connectors via Docker, you can download it from the website portal. So if you just go there, sign in with your credentials, and you'll have access to download that. It's easy to deploy and configure, full SSL support. So all of the features that you expect in the connector, they're available. It just gives you a much quicker and faster route to deployment and for you to manage it within your own Dockerized environment. So this is the point where I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Matthew, who will continue the rest of this presentation for you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. So now I'm going to talk about backup and recovery, and specifically the tool called T-provision. So that allows you to re-provision a host in your cluster by reaching out to another working host, backing up the database, and restoring it onto the current host and bringing it into the cluster. So it's a one command tool that does everything for you to bring a database host back into the cluster. with a fresh copy of the database. This was called Tungsten Provision Slave prior to version 7, and it's undergone a lot of changes. It's a lot more efficient. And again, since it takes a backup of the source database, there were typically two methods to do that, either MySQL dump or extra backup. Well, we've added more methods now. So the first one is rsync, and just like it sounds, what that does is it goes to the source database and rsyncs the database back to the target. Now, simply copying a database normally is not a good idea because you'll end up with inconsistencies in your database and the file system. But there are ways to make this work, and it could work really efficiently when done correctly. And so, what we do is the following. So, we actually do the rsync twice, right? The first time that we do the rsync, the first pass, we're simply copying the raw files, rsyncing them to the target. By doing that, we're getting most of the data and really almost all of the changes between the source and the target synced up, right? But our resulting database is not going to be in a consistent state, but it's going to be pretty close to having all of the changes. Now, the second pass actually locks the source and quiesces the database. Now we do the final rsync, which should be quite quick because we've already done the previous one to sync most of the changes. And then the resulting database here should be a consistent copy because the source was quiesced at this point. So the reason why we do it in two passes is simply to reduce the amount of time that the database is locked. And then what you can also do if you really wanted to, if you're concerned about your maintenance window, you need to have absolute minimum downtime. You can throughout the day just do the first pass, just seed the database, seed all the changes. And then right when you have your database maintenance window, you can do the second pass. Um, so one caveat here is that if your source is going to be a primary, note that it is going to be locked for some amount of time, and that could take your application offline. If your source is from a replica, then no problem. Your replica might be offline for a little bit, but that's okay. But when it's a primary, now you have to really use caution and make sure that you can really afford that downtime. Um, there is also another method, it's called MySQL clone, and this leverages the MySQL clone support that's included with MySQL 8. So basically, it goes out to the source, makes that the donor database, and copies the database using MySQL clone to the target. It's pretty handy. It's fully supported by MySQL, and you can do it on a primary without locking it. Again, only caveat here is that it supports only InnoDB table types, but most everyone is using only InnoDB as well. And if you do want to run this and there are non-InnoDB table types, it will give you a warning. Just some other things too. If your data and log and undo files are in separate directories, tprovision now handles that as well. It'll back up your SSL certs just to make sure. And there's a lot more improved logging and error handling. We check for prerequisites up front. And if we find that the prerequisite is not met, then we'll give you a friendly error so it can be rectified. And then you can try the MySQL or the tprovision again. Tungsten dashboard too has gone through a lot of changes. A lot of them are under the hood and they're making the dashboard perform exceptionally well. And a lot of that has to do with making use of API version 2, which was introduced in Tungsten Cluster version 7. That has allowed a lot more enhancements and efficiency to be built into the dashboard. But also with the dashboard, now we have integration and access to Prometheus and Grafana. So you can use Prometheus with a dashboard to collect metrics, right? And you can use Grafana to visualize all the metrics that you're collecting. And you can do this all within the Tungsten dashboard. So now Tungsten dashboard, in addition to being able to just manage clusters and view clusters, you can pull a lot of metrics and visualize them right within the dashboard. So now the dashboard is really a powerful tool. And if you're not using the dashboard with your cluster, I'd recommend having a look at it. It's included with the Tungsten Cluster package, and it really does a lot for administration, and it's a great visualization tool as well. Some other enhancements. For any node, you can add notes to it. So if you want to just, make some quick notes, this node for this, or this node has these properties or whatever, that's easy to do. And you can do it right in the dashboard and then have a look at your notes. Um, you can use it for, who knows, location, region, anything like that, whatever you want. Um, Audit trail, right? So for all updates that are done within the dashboard, if you want, you can look at an audit trail of all these updates. So if something has, via the dashboard, some management is taking place, or maybe someone did a switch or something like that, this can all be logged and reviewed later. So that's a pretty powerful tool, especially when using role-based access control, right? And maybe you can fine tune permissions or access by looking through the audit trail. Um, One other interesting feature is being able to highlight rows of nodes where the replicator is lagging by a certain threshold that you specify. So this is kind of interesting. You can see at a glance, real quickly, which nodes are lagging, and you can specify the thresholds. So if it gets below or above a certain threshold, it'll be obvious. Those rows will be highlighted, and you can investigate and see if that's normal or not. Uh, Another thing too is being able to display the API recalls if you want. And why would you do this? Well, if you just want to learn a little bit about how the Tungsten API works, sure, we have documentation for it and we have tools to help it. But you can also just have the dashboard display the API calls, and that'll help you get familiar with using the Tungsten API. So also too, for transparency, right? You know exactly what the dashboard is doing, and in addition, for learning, for audit purposes. And also, again, with API v2, the dashboard can take advantage of this, and there's a lot better performance now, even for links of low bandwidth, right? Or if you have maybe 100 or so clusters and you want to administrate them through the dashboard, it's a lot more efficient now for doing this. So we shouldn't see any really major performance issues. We saw some with in prior versions when there were a lot of clusters, but now that's all been addressed. And we've added some additional features and enhancements as well. Um, a new script, Tungsten Purge THL. So before, you could purge THL on demand if you wanted to. You could specify a number of days to retain THL, and after that expired, they would be purged. But now this script will intelligently figure out what THL has already been applied to all nodes and simply remove it, right? So this is a great way to free up some disk space if, for instance, you have a lot of THL, maybe a lot of updates, and you want to quickly free up some space, you can use this script. TAPI, T-A-P-I, easy command line access to API v2. So if you want to write your own monitoring tools or functions, you can call TAPI to allow easy access to our API. And now the replicator does THL compression and encryption on disk. So this is pretty big, right? THL can grow, it can be quite large. Well, by compressing it, we can save a lot of space. And of course, encrypting it on disk, that's also important to hide any sort of sensitive information. So we've always done, or not always, but we've had SSL for THL. So that would be in flight, but now encryption right on the disk as well. The connector also has audit logging you can turn on if you'd like. It will produce a lot of output, but you can see exactly what's running through the connector. So that might be useful for analysis later. Maybe you have an application that you can't figure out exactly what it's doing. Well, this audit logging through the connector might be able to help you. Connector drain feature. So like a lot of load balancers, now we can gracefully tell the connector to stop um, accepting new connections and wait for connections that are already established to finish. And this is how a load balancer would remove an application server from rotation. We don't want new connections to be routed to this application, or in this case, connector. So we prevent that, right? So all the traffic will be routed to other applications, servers, or other connectors, but we don't want to just simply cut off any connections that are in process, right? So we finish those, and then we shut down the connector after all, if it's processed all connections. We're now supporting ARM64, right? ARM64 is becoming popular. We see it in Amazon too, a lot of ARM64 CPU instances. We've tested on it, and now we support it. We're also supporting IPv6 as well. There's been some ask for that. And another feature too, may seem kind of small, but it's going to save everyone a lot of time. We can turn off the replicator auto recovery automatically. We don't need to change a property now and then restart the replicator. We can simply just turn off auto recovery when we want to. And well, why would that be useful? Well, auto recovery is good, right? If the replicator encounters an error, sure, we want to retry just to make sure it's not some sort of transient issue. But if we know that we're doing some maintenance and we're going to see some errors, we don't want the replicator to keep retrying when we know that these errors are going to persist, right? So we would just turn off auto recovery, fix our errors, whatever, address our issues, and then have the replicator come online. We know it's good, and then turn auto recovery back on. So that'll save some time when dealing with replication issues. And looking ahead on the horizon, so we've had a major focus on Kubernetes, and we're continuing to work on Kubernetes Operator for Tungsten Cluster. And as you may know, that's going to ease deployment of Tungsten clusters, as well as allow for orchestration, automation, and portability of the containers that the cluster is deployed in. So that's something that's really exciting for us, and that should make deployment, again, much easier and much more scalable. Along with that, further improvements to the dashboard. As part of these automations and orchestrations, they're going to be integrated into the dashboard as well. So stay tuned for that because there's quite a bit happening there on the UI front. With T-Provision, we're constantly updating that as well. And T-Provision is going to be more than a tool just for reprovisioning a failed node. Because if we look down at the next bullet point, Tungsten backup. So imagine a new backup method that allows you to have point-in-time backup, recovery, and just really easy take multiple backups and have multiple backup servers of your entire cluster, or even a standalone MySQL instance. So more about that later. Look for the news that we send out. And we want to thank you for listening to our webinar. And we really hope that you're as excited about the upcoming changes that we're doing as we are. Thank you.